I never thought my son would be the one to break me completely. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains I'd hung 40 years ago, carefully arranging my grandmother's bone china tea set for what I didn't know would be our last conversation. Everett had called the night before, his voice strained, asking if he could stop by. At 72, I'd learned to recognize the tone that meant trouble, but I'd hoped this time might be different. The delicate cups sat perfectly aligned, steam rising from the Earl Grey I'd prepared with the same care I'd shown when he was a boy coming home from school. But some conversations shatter more than expectations. What would you do if the person you loved most in the world told you that you deserved to die alone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house felt different that morning, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was the weight of anticipation, or maybe it was the way the autumn light seemed more golden than usual as it danced across the hardwood floors I'd polished just yesterday. I moved through my daily routine with the precision that comes from decades of practice, though my hands trembled slightly as I arranged the tea service. This house had been my sanctuary for 35 years, purchased with the modest inheritance from my mother after my husband Robert died. Everett was only 12 then, a gangly boy with Robert's stubborn jawline and my tendency toward brooding silence. The walls around me held the echoes of his childhood, scraped knees tended at this very table, homework battles fought and won. The gradual transformation from sweet boy to sullen teenager to the successful man he'd become. The living room showcased the remnants of my teaching career, though I'd packed away most of the awards and certificates years ago. 35 years of shaping young minds at Lincoln Elementary, and what did I have to show for it? A modest pension, a house that creaked with age, and a son who called perhaps twice a month out of obligation rather than affection. I paused before the mantelpiece, where 3 dusty plaques still hung: Teacher of the Year 1987, Excellence in Education 1994, and the Community Service Award from 2001. Each one represented a year when someone else's child had needed me, had benefited from my patience and dedication. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been better at nurturing other people's children than my own. The kitchen held its own memories, birthday cakes baked with love, if not skill, packed lunches that Everett rarely appreciated, countless dinners eaten in silence as he grew older and more distant. I'd tried to bridge that gap in the only ways I knew how, through consistency, through providing, through being present even when he clearly preferred I wasn't. Robert's death had changed everything. One moment I was a wife and mother navigating the ordinary challenges of family life, and the next I was a widow trying to raise a grieving preteen who blamed me for not being able to save his father from the heart attack that claimed him at 43. Everett never said as much directly, but I could see it in his eyes, the accusation that somehow I'd failed them both. Those teenage years had been particularly difficult. Everett acted out in ways that terrified me, staying out all night, experimenting with substances I pretended not to notice, bringing home friends who made my skin crawl with their hollow eyes and practice smirks. I documented it all in my journal, seeking solace in the written word when spoken words failed us both. Writing had always been my refuge, a place where I could process the confusion and heartbreak of watching my son slip away from me. But Everett had found his way eventually. After a particularly frightening incident during his senior year, one that I still couldn't think about without my chest tightening, he'd seemed to snap out of his destructive phase. College had transformed him, or perhaps he'd simply learned to channel his intensity into more productive outlets. He'd discovered a talent for public speaking, for inspiring others with stories of overcoming adversity and finding purpose. Now, at 45, he was Dr. Everett Perch, best-selling author and motivational speaker. His TED Talk on rewriting your story had been viewed millions of times. He traveled the country speaking to corporate groups and university audiences about resilience, self-determination, and the power of positive thinking. His book, The Phoenix Path, had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I was proud of him, of course. How could I not be? But there was something hollow about his success that I couldn't quite name. In his public appearances, which I watched religiously on YouTube, he spoke about his challenging upbringing with a casual detachment that made it sound almost mythological. The way he told it, he'd been raised by a single mother who'd done her best but lacked the emotional tools to truly connect with her son. He painted me as well-meaning but cold, someone who'd provided for his physical needs while neglecting his emotional ones. The characterization stung because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I hadn't been demonstrative in the way Robert had been. I showed love through actions rather than words, through sacrifice rather than affection. When Everett needed new shoes, I worked extra hours tutoring to afford them. When he wanted to join the debate team, I drove him to every practice and tournament, even though we barely spoke during those long car rides. But love. I'd loved him so fiercely, it frightened me sometimes. I simply hadn't known how to show it in ways he could recognize and accept. Now, as I waited for his arrival, I found myself wondering what had prompted this unexpected visit. We typically saw each other 3 times a year, his birthday in March, my birthday in September, and Christmas. It was October now, well outside our established schedule. His voice on the phone had carried an edge I hadn't heard in years, a tension that reminded me uncomfortably of his teenage years. I adjusted the sugar bowl for the 3rd time and glanced at the clock. He was 15 minutes late, which was unlike him. Everett prided himself on punctuality, another lesson I tried to instill during those difficult years after Robert's death. Respect other people's time, I told him countless times, and they'll respect yours. The sound of tires on gravel finally broke the morning silence. I smoothed my grey hair, checked my reflection in the hall mirror, and tried to calm the anxiety that had been building all morning. Through the front window, I watched him emerge from his expensive sedan, still tall and lean, his dark hair now touched with distinguished silver at the temples. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention, but something in his posture suggested barely controlled anger. My heart began to race as he approached the front door. In all our complicated history, Everett had never been cruel, merely distant. We'd learned to navigate our relationship through careful politeness, avoiding the emotional landmines that had defined his adolescence. But as I opened the door to greet him, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but contempt. "Hello, Mother," he said. And even those simple words carried a chill that made me step back. "Everett, come in. I've made tea." He followed me to the kitchen, but remained standing while I poured, his eyes scanning the familiar space as if seeing it for the first time. Or perhaps seeing it for the last time. The thought sent a shiver through me that I couldn't explain. "You wanted to talk," I said, settling into my chair and wrapping my hands around the warm cup for comfort. He didn't sit. Instead, he began pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum I'd installed when he was in high school. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but I could hear the fury underneath. "I've been doing some thinking lately about my childhood, about the way I was raised." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "About the way you raised me." My stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've finally come to terms with the fact that you were never really a mother to me. You were a caretaker, maybe, a provider. But you never loved me the way a mother should love her child." The words hit me like physical blows. "Everett, that's not true. I've always loved you." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, Mother, you love the idea of being a good mother. You love the recognition you got for being the poor widow raising her son alone. But you never loved me." I tried to stand, to reach for him, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not finished." His voice grew colder, more certain. "Do you know what it was like growing up in this house? Do you have any idea what it felt like to live with someone who went through the motions of caring, but never actually felt anything?" Tears was starting to blur my vision. "I don't understand where this is coming from. We've had our difficulties, but I thought we'd found a way to what? To pretend, to act like we have some kind of normal relationship." He shook his head. "I'm tired of pretending, Mother. I'm tired of feeling guilty for not loving someone who never loved me back." The accusation hung in the air between us like a living thing. I searched his face for some sign of the boy I'd raised, but found only the cold stranger he'd become. "I need you to understand something," he continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I'm done with this charade, with these obligatory visits, with pretending that we're anything more than strangers who happen to share DNA." My hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my teacup. "Everett, please. Whatever I did wrong, whatever I failed to give you, we can work through it. We can try to." "No, Mother, we can't." He stopped pacing and looked directly at me, his eyes as cold as winter stone. "Because you know what I realized. You don't deserve to have a son. You don't deserve to have anyone who cares about you. You deserve to die alone, just like you made me feel alone every day of my childhood." The words hung in the air like poison. I felt something break inside me, something that had been holding me together for 72 years. The bone china teacup slipped from my trembling fingers and shattered against the floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden silence. Everett left immediately after speaking those words, as if saying them had released him from some obligation he'd been carrying for years. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the fragments of my grandmother's teacup scattered across the linoleum, unable to move or even breathe properly. The silence in the house felt different now, not peaceful, but empty, hollow. I'm not sure how long I remained there. The autumn sun shifted position, casting different shadows across the kitchen floor, but I couldn't seem to gather the strength to clean up the broken china or even to move from my chair. My mind kept replaying his words, searching for some hidden meaning, some way to interpret them that might hurt less, but there was no softening their edges. My son, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, truly believed I deserved to die alone. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as if I'd aged a decade in the span of our conversation. I carefully gathered the larger pieces of the teacup, remembering how my grandmother had used it every Sunday after church. She'd been a warm woman, quick to laugh and generous with hugs. I'd always felt I'd inherited her practical nature but missed out on her natural warmth. Perhaps that's where I'd failed Everett, in being too much like my father's stoic German family and not enough like my mother's affectionate Irish clan. I found myself walking to the living room, where the photo albums I rarely looked at anymore sat gathering dust on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. I pulled out the thick album labelled Everett, birth to 18 inches, and opened it to a random page. There he was at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing he'd made for Mother's Day. I could still remember that morning, how proud he'd been to present me with his crayon masterpiece, how he'd watched my face anxiously for approval. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I'd said, and meant it. The drawing showed to stick figures under a yellow sun, labelled me and Mum in his careful printing. Where had that little boy gone? When had he stopped drawing me pictures and started seeing me as the cold, unloving woman Everett described? I turned the pages slowly, each photograph a window into a past that now seemed rewritten by his accusations. Here was his 10th birthday party, just the two of us, and a homemade chocolate cake. I'd worked 3 weekends tutoring to afford the bicycle he'd wanted, and the joy on his face when he saw it propped against the kitchen counter had made every extra hour worthwhile. But looking at the photo now, I noticed how I stood slightly apart from him, my smile genuine but restrained. Even in moments of celebration, I'd maintained that careful distance. Robert had been the hugger in our family, the one who roughhoused with Everett and read bedtime stories with different voices. For each character, after he died, I'd tried to fill both roles, but I'd never been comfortable with casual physical affection. My own mother had shown love through cooking and cleaning and making sure we had what we needed, not through constant embraces and verbal reassurances. I'd parented the only way I knew how, but perhaps that hadn't been enough. Perhaps Everett's assessment was more accurate than I wanted to admit. The photograph that stopped me cold was tucked near the back of the album, Everett at 17, standing stiffly beside me at his high school graduation. We both looked uncomfortable, like strangers forced together for an obligatory picture. I remembered that day clearly because it had marked the end of what I now realized were the worst years of our relationship. His junior and senior years had been a nightmare of worrying and sleepless nights. There had been the incident with the stolen car that I'd covered up to protect his college prospects. The time I'd found drug paraphernalia in his room and we'd had the first of many screaming matches about his future, the night he'd come home. Bloody and incoherent, claiming he'd been in a fight but refusing to tell me with whom or why. I'd documented all of it in my journal, needing somewhere to process the fear and frustration that consumed those months. Writing had been my lifeline during Robert's illness and death, and it became my refuge again during Everett's troubled adolescence. Every night, I'd pour out my worries onto the pages of a leather-bound diary I kept locked in my bedroom drawer. I wrote about my fears for Everett's future, my confusion about how to help him, my growing sense of failure as a parent. The journal also contained my most honest thoughts about our relationship, admissions I could never make aloud, how I sometimes felt overwhelmed by the intensity of his need for connection, how I worried that my reserved nature was damaging him in ways I couldn't undo, how I lay awake wondering if Robert would have done better, would have somehow reached our son in ways I couldn't. After Everett turned 18 and left for college, our relationship had slowly stabilized into something manageable but distant. He'd found his footing academically and socially, discovered his talent for public speaking, and seemed to channel his earlier rebelliousness into more constructive pursuits. We'd learned to interact as polite acquaintances rather than mother and son, and I'd convinced myself that was enough. That it was better than the constant conflict of his teenage years. But sitting there with the photo album in my lap, I realized I'd been fooling myself. The distance between us hadn't healed anything. It had simply allowed us to avoid dealing with the fundamental disconnect that had always existed. And now, apparently, Everett had decided he was tired of avoiding it. I closed the album and walked to my bedroom, where I unlocked the drawer that contained my journals. There were dozens of them, dating back to the early days of my marriage. I pulled out the one from Everett's senior year, when things had been at their worst between us. The leather cover was worn soft from handling, and the pages fell open naturally to entries I'd read and reread over the years. March 15th, 1997 found pills in E's jacket pocket again. Not sure what they are, but they're not prescription. Confronted him after dinner and he exploded, accused me of not trusting him, of trying to control his life. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm too controlling. But how do I watch my child self-destruct and do nothing? I would have known what to say, how to reach him. I feel so inadequate, so lost. March 28, 1997. He didn't come home last night, called the school, and he was there today, acting like nothing happened. I'm walking on eggshells, afraid that if I push too hard he'll run away completely. But if I don't push at all, am I just enabling his behavior? I don't know how to love him the right way anymore, or maybe I never did. April 12, 1997, the worst night yet. He came home at 3 a.m., clearly under the influence of something. When I tried to talk to him, he started yelling about how I never understood him, how I was just going through the motions of being a mother without actually caring. It hurt because there's truth in it. I do feel like I'm performing motherhood sometimes, following a script I never quite learned properly. But the caring, that's real, that's always been real, even if I don't know how to show it. Reading my own words from 26 years ago, I felt the familiar ache of those memories. But I also heard something else, the voice of a woman who was trying desperately to connect with her son, but didn't know how. Whatever my failures, they hadn't come from lack of love. They'd come from lack of skill, lack of intuition, lack of the natural maternal warmth that seemed to come so easily to other women. But was that really my fault? I'd done the best I could with the tools I had. I'd worked extra jobs to ensure Everett never went without. I'd attended every school event, helped with homework, driven him wherever he needed to go. I'd sacrificed my own social life and dating prospects to focus entirely on raising him. If that wasn't love, what was? Yeah, here I sat, alone in my bedroom at 72, holding the evidence of my own confusion and inadequacy. Here I sat, having been told by my only child that I deserved to die alone. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had failed so fundamentally as a mother that this isolation was exactly what I deserved. The thought should have devastated me further, but instead it sparked something unexpected, a flicker of anger. For 26 years since his high School graduation, I'd accepted the narrative that our problems were primarily my fault. I'd swallowed his subtle criticisms in his public speeches, his characterization of me as emotionally unavailable, but well-meaning. I told myself that, if that's how he needed to frame his childhood to find success and happiness, then I could live with it. But now he'd crossed a line. Now he'd moved from subtle criticism to outright cruelty. And for the first time in decades, I found myself questioning whether I should accept that treatment simply because he was my son. I thought about my students. Over the years, hundreds of children who had passed through my classroom. Many had come from difficult home situations, and I'd watched their parents struggle with the same challenges I'd faced with Everett. Some had succeeded in maintaining close relationships with their children despite their imperfections. Others had been shut out completely, left to wonder where they'd gone wrong. The difference, I realized now, wasn't necessarily in the quality of the parenting. Sometimes it was simply in the child's capacity for forgiveness, their ability to see their parents as flawed human beings rather than failed ideals. Everett had built his entire adult identity around overcoming his challenging upbringing. His success story required me to be the obstacle he'd conquered, the deficit he'd overcome. But what if that narrative was preventing him from seeing me clearly? What if his need to be a self-made man required him to minimize any positive impact I might have had on his life? I closed the journal and looked around my bedroom, at the wedding photo where Robert and I looked impossibly young and hopeful. At the small watercolor Everett had painted in 4th grade art class, at the comfortable life I'd built for myself in the years since his departure. This house had been my sanctuary for 3 decades, the place where I'd healed from Robert's death and found my footing as a single woman. But suddenly it felt like a trap. Every corner held memories of a relationship that had apparently been doomed from the start. Every room echoed with the voices of a mother and son who had never quite learned to speak the same emotional language. For the first time since Everett's visit, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that maybe he was right about one thing. Maybe it was time to end this charade. Not because I deserved to die alone, but because I deserved better than to spend my remaining years trying to earn love from someone who had already decided I was unworthy of it. The decision didn't come all at once, but I felt it beginning to form in the space between my anger and my heartbreak. Maybe it was time to stop apologizing for who I was and start figuring out who I could still become. The moving boxes arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. Plain brown cardboard that seemed to mark the permanence I'd thought I'd built in this house. I'd ordered them online 3 weeks after Everett's visit, during one of those sleepless 3 a.m. moments when clarity and desperation feel indistinguishable. The delivery man was young, maybe Everett's age, and he looked concerned as he stacked the dozens of boxes in my living room. "You sure you ordered this many, ma'am?" he asked, double-checking his receipt. "That's a lot of boxes for one person." "I'm sure," I told him, signing for the delivery with hands that barely trembled anymore. I'd moved past the shaking stage into something steadier but more final. "I have 72 years of life to pack up." He looked like he wanted to ask more questions but settled for a polite nod and a careful good luck with your move. After he left, I stood in my living room, surrounded by flat cardboard waiting to be assembled, and felt the strangest sense of relief. For weeks, I'd been walking through my house like a ghost, touching familiar objects and wondering if they still belonged to me. The conversation with Everett had changed the very air in this place, made it feel like a museum of a life that had been built on false premises. But now I had a plan. More than that, I had an escape route. It had taken me weeks to work up the courage to even consider leaving. The initial shock of Everett's words had left me paralyzed, cycling between rage and self-doubt without finding any solid ground to stand on. I'd call my doctor about increasing my blood pressure medication, then spend hours staring at real estate websites. I'd start letters to Everett that I never finished, apologies that felt both necessary and humiliating. The breakthrough had come during one of my regular grocery runs to the small market downtown. I'd been standing in the checkout line behind a woman about my age who was buying ingredients for what was clearly a large family dinner, multiple packages of everything, enough food to feed a crowd. The cashier, a teenage girl I'd seen there 4 months, was chatting with her about week and plans. My daughter's bringing the grandkids over, the woman was saying, her face bright with anticipation. It'll be chaos, but the good kind, you know. I'd stood there holding my basket of groceries for one, listening to this stranger describe the kind of life I'd always imagined I'd have at this age. Holidays with children and grandchildren, a house full of laughter and mess, and the comfortable chaos of multiple generations gathering together. But that wasn't my life. It had never been my life, and Everett's recent visit had made it clear it never would be. I was 72 years old, and I was wasting what good years I had left waiting for a relationship that existed only in my imagination. That night, I'd pulled out my laptop and started researching small coastal towns in Oregon. I'd always loved the ocean, but had never lived near it. Robert and I had talked about retiring somewhere with a view of the water, but his death had anchored me to this inland life, where everything felt safe and predictable. Now, safety and predictability felt like prison walls. I found myself drawn to a tiny town called Cannon Beach, 3 hours from my current home, but light years away in terms of atmosphere. The rental listings showed cottages with weathered shingles and gardens running wild with coastal plants I'd never tried to grow. There was something about the photos that spoke to me, not just the scenic beauty, but the sense that this was a place where a person could reinvent themselves without explanation or apology. The cottage I eventually chose was small but perfect. Just 2 bedrooms with a kitchen that looked out over a vegetable garden and a living room that faced the ocean. The rent was higher than I'd planned to spend, but I had my teacher's pension and the small nest egg I'd built over the years. More importantly, I had no one depending on me anymore. No one whose opinion about my decisions mattered. I'd called the landlord, a woman named Patricia who sounded about my age, and arranged to rent the place sight unseen starting in January. It was an impulsive decision that the old Stephania would never have made. But the old Stephania had spent decades trying to be the kind of mother who could earn her son's love. That project had officially failed. Now, assembling the first moving box with more determination than I'd felt in months, I began the process of dismantling a life that no longer fit me. I started with the obvious things: books I'd read multiple times, kitchen gadgets I rarely used, the accumulation of small objects that somehow multiply over the decades of living in one place. But as I worked my way through the house, each decision became more loaded with meaning. What do you take when you're not just moving houses, but moving lives? What do you leave behind when you're trying to shed the version of yourself that someone else has found so unworthy of love? I packed my teaching awards, even though they represented a career that was behind me. I'd been good at my job, genuinely good, and that deserved acknowledgement, even if my role as a mother had been less successful. I packed my journals, all of them, because they contained the most honest record of who I'd been and who I was becoming. I packed the quilt my mother had made for my wedding, because some connections are worth preserving regardless of what others might think, but I left the family photos on the mantelpiece. I left the Christmas ornaments Everett had made in elementary school. I left the birthday cards he'd given me over the years, with their dutiful love, Everett's signatures that now felt more like obligations than endearments, and I left his high school diploma, which I kept framed in my bedroom even though he'd never asked for it. I left the newspaper clipping from his college graduation, where he'd been featured as a promising young speaker. I left the copy of his book that he'd signed for me with the inscription to Mom, who taught me that you have to find your own way in the world. At the time, I thought that inscription was touching. Now I wondered if it had been his polite way of saying I taught him he couldn't depend on anyone else for emotional support. The hardest decision was what to do with the journal from his senior year, the one that contained my most raw and honest reflections about our relationship. During those difficult months, it was evidence of my struggles as a parent, but it was also evidence of how much I'd cared, how desperately I'd wanted to reach him despite my obvious limitations. In the end, I decided to leave it behind, not out of shame, but out of a kind of resignation. If Everett ever wanted to understand what those years had been like from my perspective, if he ever wanted to see me as something more than the cold caricature he'd created, it would be there, hidden in the locked drawer where I'd kept it for 26 years, waiting for a reconciliation that might never come. The packing took 3 weeks, during which I spoke to no one except the occasional telemarketer and the grocery store cashiers. I'd always been somewhat solitary, but this felt different. Not loneliness exactly, but a kind of pruning. I was cutting away everything that no longer served the person I was trying to become. I didn't tell Everett about my plans. We hadn't spoken since his devastating visit, and I saw no reason to inform him that his words had achieved their intended effect. Let him discover my absence in his own time, in his own way. Maybe he'd feel relief that he no longer had to maintain even the pretense of a relationship with me. Maybe he'd feel guilt. Maybe he wouldn't feel anything at all. During those weeks of packing, I found myself thinking about Patricia, the woman who owned the cottage I'd rented. We talked several times as I arranged the details of my lease, and she'd mentioned that she was a retired lawyer who'd moved to the coast 5 years earlier after her husband died. Best decision I ever made, she'd said during our last conversation. I wish I'd done it sooner, but I kept thinking I needed to wait for permission from someone. Finally realized the only person whose permission I needed was my own. Her words had resonated with me in ways I was still trying to understand. How much of my life had I spent waiting for permission? From Robert to be independent, from Everett to be worthy of love, from some external authority to make choices that were mine alone to make. On my last day in the house, I walked through the empty rooms one final time. The moving truck had come and gone, taking my carefully chosen possessions to a new life I could barely imagine. What remained looked like the skeleton of someone else's life. Outlines on the walls where pictures had hung, indentations in the carpet where furniture had stood for decades, the accumulation of wear patterns that showed how one person had moved through these spaces day after day, year after year. I found myself pausing in Everett's old bedroom, which I'd kept essentially unchanged since he left for college. His twin bed was still there, covered with the same navy blue comforter he'd chosen at 14. His bookshelf still held the young adult novels he devoured during his better years, before adolescent rebellion had temporarily derailed his love of reading. Standing there, I could almost see him, as he'd been at 10, sprawled on that bed reading Harry Potter books aloud to himself, doing voices for each character the way his father had taught him. That boy had loved me, I was certain of it. But somewhere along the way, that love had curdled into resentment, and I'd never figured out how to reverse the process. The adult Everett would probably be relieved to know he'd never have to see this shrine to his childhood again. He could move forward with his carefully constructed narrative about his self-made success without the uncomfortable reminder of a mother who tried, however imperfectly, to love him. I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me, leaving the key under the mat for the real estate agent. The house would go on the market next week, and someone else would fill these rooms with their own hopes and disappointments. Someone else would stand in that kitchen, making tea and planning conversations that might go better than they feared. As I drove away, I didn't look back. I'd already said goodbye to that version of myself, the woman who'd spent decades trying to be enough for people who'd decided she wasn't. Whatever happened next would be mine alone to figure out, and for the first time in years, that possibility felt like freedom rather than failure. The cottage in Cannon Beach was nothing like the pictures had suggested, and everything I hadn't realized I needed. The photographs had shown a quaint structure with weathered cedar shingles and a tidy garden, but they'd failed to capture the way the morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, or how the sound of the ocean provided a constant, gentle soundtrack to daily life. I arrived on a grey January morning when the coast was showing its moody winter personality. The previous tenant had left the cottage spotless, but somehow lifeless, like a stage set waiting for actors to bring it to life. I stood in the small living room with my suitcases and tried to imagine myself belonging here, tried to picture this unfamiliar space becoming home. The furniture I'd shipped ahead looked foreign in these new surroundings. My familiar armchair seemed too formal for the cottage's casual atmosphere, and my grandmother's china cabinet appeared overdressed against the whitewashed walls. But as I began unpacking, placing my books on the built-in shelves and hanging my mother's watercolors where they caught the ocean light, the space slowly began to feel less like a rental and more like a beginning. Patricia, my landlord, stopped by that first afternoon with a basket of local produce and a bottle of wine. She was exactly what I'd imagined from our phone conversations. A woman in her late 60s with silver hair and laugh lines, wearing jeans and a fisherman's sweater that suggested she'd fully embraced the coastal lifestyle. "How are you settling?" She asked, glancing around the cottage with the satisfaction of someone who genuinely cared about her tenant's well-being. "It's perfect," I said, and meant it. Very different from where I came from. Sometimes different is exactly what we need. She handed me the basket and looked out the window toward the ocean. I spent 40 years in Portland, practicing family law, thinking I was too busy to appreciate views like this. Took my husband dying for me to realize I'd been prioritizing all the wrong things. Her casual mention of widowhood opened a door I hadn't expected. We talked for an hour that first day, sharing the kind of honest conversation that sometimes happens between strangers who recognize something familiar in each other's story. She'd also reinvented herself later in life, also walked away from a perfectly acceptable existence to try something that felt more authentic. The first few months are strange, she warned me as she prepared to leave. You'll question everything, whether you made the right choice, whether you're too old to start over, whether anyone can really change this late in life. But stick with it, the questioning phase passes, and what comes after is better than anything you're leaving behind. I spent that first week simply learning the rhythms of my new life. The cottage was part of a small community of year-round residents who had the coast largely to themselves during the winter months. My nearest neighbour was a retired carpenter named Tom who lived in a similar cottage about a quarter-mile down the beach. I'd see him most mornings, walking his ancient golden retriever along the waterline, and we'd exchange polite nods and comments about the weather. Tom appeared to be roughly my age, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from a life spent working with his hands outdoors. His dog, a gentle creature named Buster, had immediately taken a liking to me, always wandering over to accept his scratches when our paths crossed on the beach. "Buster's got good judgment about people," Tom said one morning when the dog had abandoned his walk to sit beside me on a piece of driftwood where I'd stopped to watch the waves. "He's usually pretty standoffish with strangers. Maybe he senses I'm harmless," I replied, scratching behind Buster's ears and earning a contented sigh. "Or maybe he senses you need the company." Tom's observation was gentle, not intrusive, but it carried enough insight to make me look at him more carefully. Our friendship developed slowly, built on these morning encounters and the gradual recognition that we were both seeking something from this coastal life, not romance necessarily, but connection. Real connection, the kind based on who we were now, rather than who we'd been in our previous lives. Tom had been widowed 10 years earlier. After 42 years of marriage to his high school sweetheart, he'd moved to the coast 5 years ago, buying his cottage and setting up a small woodworking shop where he crafted furniture for local galleries. His work was beautiful, simple, elegant pieces that highlighted the natural grain of the wood, and I found myself drawn to both the craftsmanship and the man who created it. "I never thought I'd be this person," he told me one morning as we walked the beach together. "Living alone by the ocean, making furniture that nobody really needs. But it turns out this person suits me better than the one I was trying to be." For most of my life, I understood exactly what he meant. Back in my old life, I'd been defined by my relationships and responsibilities: mother, teacher, widow, caretaker. Here, I was simply Stephania, a woman learning to garden in sandy soil and discovering that she enjoyed the challenge of growing things in an environment that required patience and adaptation. The cottage came with a small vegetable garden that the previous tenant had neglected, and I threw myself into the project of bringing it back to life. I'd never been much of a gardener in my old house, too busy with work and worrying to pay attention to anything as unpredictable as growing things. But now I found myself studying coastal gardening guides and experimenting with vegetables that could thrive in the salt air. Tom became my unofficial gardening consultant, stopping by with advice about soil amendments and recommendations for plants that would tolerate the ocean breeze. He had a way of teaching through casual conversation, sharing knowledge without making me feel ignorant for not knowing things I'd never had reason to learn. The trick with coastal gardening, he told me one afternoon as we worked side by side, preparing the soil for spring planting, is accepting that you can't control everything. The weather, the salt, the wind, they're all going to have their say in what grows and what doesn't. Your job is to work with them, not against them. It seemed like advice that applied to more than gardening. During those first months, I established new routines that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule or needs. I woke when my body was ready rather than when an alarm demanded it. I read books I'd always meant to explore but never had time. 4. I took long walks on the beach, not for exercise, but for the simple pleasure of moving through a landscape that changed with each tide. And I wrote. Not in a journal this time, but letters, long, rambling letters to no one in particular about what it felt like to start over at 72. I wrote about the liberation of washing dishes for one person, of choosing what to cook based solely on my own preferences. I wrote about the way the ocean looked different at every hour of the day, and how that constant change had taught me to pay attention to small variations that I'd never noticed before. I wrote about Tom, too, though I was careful not to read too much into our growing friendship. He was kind and interesting and clearly attracted to me in a way I hadn't experienced in decades, but I was cautious about allowing myself to want anything too much. I'd spent too many years wanting things from people who couldn't or wouldn't provide them, but Tom's interest seemed uncomplicated, based on genuine appreciation for who I was rather than disappointment in who I wasn't. When he brought me a small wooden bird he'd carved, a robin with its wings slightly spread as if preparing to take flight, I felt something I'd almost forgotten was possible. I felt cherished. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's beautiful, I said, turning the carved bird over in my hands and marveling at the detail he'd achieved with just a few simple tools. It reminded me of you, he said, and then seemed slightly embarrassed by the admission. Something about starting fresh, taking flight. I placed the wooden robin on my kitchen windowsill, where it caught the morning light, and reminded me daily that someone saw me as capable of new beginnings rather than trapped by old failures. Spring came early that year, and with it a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in decades. My garden began to show signs of life, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil I'd amended with Tom's help. The cottage felt less like a temporary refuge and more like home. I'd made friends at the local library, joined a book club that met monthly at a coffee shop downtown, and discovered that I enjoyed having conversations about literature with people who knew nothing about my history as a failed mother. But it was the absence of Everett's judgment that provided the deepest relief. For the first time in 26 years, I could make choices without wondering how they might affect our relationship or what ammunition they might provide for his narrative about my inadequacy. I could be selfish without guilt, generous without suspicion, imperfect without constant self-recrimination. I hadn't heard from him since leaving, which was both expected and somehow liberating. My old phone number had been disconnected, my forwarding address known only to essential services and Patricia. If Everett wanted to find me, he could, but he'd have to make an effort. And his silence suggested he had no interest in making that effort. Some mornings I woke up and realized I'd gone entire days without thinking about him, without wondering what he was doing or whether he ever thought about me. It felt like recovering from a chronic illness I'd grown so accustomed to that I'd forgotten what health felt like. You look different than when you first arrived, Tom observed one afternoon as we sat on his deck sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset. More settled, like you've decided this place agrees with you. It does agree with me, I said, surprising myself with how confident I sounded. I didn't expect it to, but it does. Any regrets about leaving your old life behind? I considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, I would have answered automatically, listing all the ways I should feel guilty for abandoning my son, my house, my history. But the woman sitting on Tom's deck, watching the Pacific Ocean turn gold in the evening light, felt no obligation to apologize for choosing herself for once. No, I said finally. No regrets at all. And for the first time in my adult life, that was completely true. The call came on a Tuesday morning in June, just as I was deadheading the roses that had finally begun to bloom in my coastal garden. Patricia's voice on the phone carried an urgency that immediately made my stomach clench with the familiar anxiety of bad news. Stephania, I need to ask you something. And I want you to know you can tell me to mind my own business if this is too personal." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "Did you leave anything behind in your old house? Anything that might be ... significant?" I set down my gardening shears and sank into the weathered Adirondack chair Tom had built for my small patio. "What do you mean, significant? I'm getting calls from reporters. Something about your son, and some kind of journal. They seem to think I might know how to reach you." The words hit me like cold water. In all my careful planning for this new life, I'd somehow failed to consider that the past might eventually reach out and grab me. Even here, what kind of reporters? Local news, mostly, but also someone from Portland and another one who said she was freelance, but working on a story about public figures and their family backgrounds. Patricia's voice was gentle, but concerned. "Stephania, whatever this is about, you don't owe anyone an explanation, but if you need support, I'm here." After we hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, trying to process what Patricia had told me. Reporters asking about Everett and a journal could only mean one thing. Someone had found the diary I'd left hidden in my bedroom drawer, the journal from his senior year, with all my raw, honest reflections about his troubled adolescence and my struggles as a parent. My first instinct was panic. That journal contained my most private thoughts about Everett's behavior during those difficult years, the drinking, the drugs, the night he'd come home blooded and incoherent. I'd written about the stolen car in Sutton that I'd helped cover up, about finding drug paraphernalia in his room, about the fights we'd had when I'd tried to intervene in his self-destructive behavior. But it also contained something else, evidence of how much I'd cared, how desperately I'd tried to reach him despite my obvious limitations as a parent. Evidence that contradicted his public narrative about emerging from a cold, unsupportive household through pure determination and self-reliance. I pulled out my laptop and did what I'd been avoiding for months. I searched for Everett's name online. The results made my heart sink and, unexpectedly, sparked a flicker of anger I hadn't felt since deciding to leave my old life behind. The first article was from a local Portland blog called The Real Story, written by someone named Jessica Holbrook. The headline read, "Motivational Speaker Dr. Everett Perch's Secret History, What His Mother's Journal Reveals About His Self-Made Success Story." I clicked on the article with trembling fingers and immediately recognized excerpts from my own handwriting. Jessica Holbrook had somehow gotten hold of my journal and was using my most private thoughts to expose the contradictions in Everett's public persona, according to Stephania Perch's detailed journal entries from 1996 to 1997. Her son Everett's senior year of high school was marked by serious behavioral issues that contradict his claims of being a focused, self-directed student who overcame adversity through determination alone. The article quoted directly from my journal entries, the ones where I documented coming home to find him drunk, where I'd written about my fears that he was heading for serious trouble, where I'd agonized over whether to call the police when he stayed out all night with friends I suspected were involved in drug dealing. He came home at 3 a.m. again, clearly under the influence of something. When I confronted him, he became belligerent, saying I didn't understand him and never would. Found what looks like cocaine residue on his dresser. I'm terrified he's going to end up dead or in jail, but every time I try to talk to him about it, he shuts down or explodes. I feel like I'm losing him completely, and I don't know how to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. But Jessica Holbrook had taken my words out of context, using them to paint a picture of Everett as a troubled teenager whose mother had enabled his behavior, rather than the story I'd actually been trying to tell, that of a mother desperately trying to help a son who was spiraling out of control. The article went on to detail other incidents I'd recorded, the time Everett had been brought home by police after being found passed out in a public park, the stolen car in Sutton that I'd helped him navigate to avoid criminal charges, the graduation party where he'd been hospitalized for alcohol poisoning but had somehow managed to keep it out of the official school records. All of it was true. All of it had happened exactly as I'd written it. But the way Jessica Holbrook presented, it made it sound like Everett had been a juvenile delinquent whose mother had been complicit in covering up his crimes, rather than the more complicated reality of a grieving teenager acting out and a mother who'd prioritized protecting his future over exposing his mistakes. I scrolled through the comments section, feeling sick as I read the responses from people who knew Everett professionally. Former clients questioning whether someone with such a troubled past could legitimately help others overcome adversity. Conference organizers expressing concern about having booked him for upcoming events, colleagues distancing themselves from someone whose inspirational narrative had apparently been built on lies. My phone rang again, this time displaying an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message. Miss Perch, this is David Chan from Channel 12 News. We're working on a story about your son, Dr. Everett Perch, and some journal entries that have recently come to light. We'd love to get your perspective on the allegations that he's misrepresented his background in his professional career. Please call me back at ... I deleted the message without writing down the number, then turned off my phone entirely. Within an hour, I could see a news van parked at the end of my street, and I realized that my carefully constructed new life was about to be invaded by the fallout from decisions I'd made nearly 30 years ago. Tom appeared at my back door around noon, looking concerned and carrying a thermos of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, glancing toward the news van that was now one of three parked along the usually quiet residential street. Patricia called me. Sounds like you're dealing with some unwanted attention. I let him in and tried to explain the situation without revealing too much of the painful history with Everett. But Tom listened with the kind of patient attention that made it impossible to give him anything less than the whole truth. By the time I finished, he was holding my hands across my small kitchen table, his weathered face full of sympathy and something that looked like protective anger. So let me understand this, he said slowly. You wrote down your private thoughts about trying to help your troubled teenager. Some reporter got hold of those writings years later, and now you're being blamed for ... What exactly? Caring too much. Trying to protect your son from the consequences of his own behavior. The journalist is making it sound like I enabled him, like I helped him cover up criminal behavior that contradicts the story he tells about his past. Did you? The question was direct, but not accusatory. Tom was asking because he wanted to understand, not because he was judging me. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe, when you're watching your child self-destruct, you make choices based on fear, rather than wisdom. I was terrified that if he got arrested or expelled, it would ruin his chances for college and a decent future. So yes, I helped him avoid consequences that might have been exactly what he needed. But you were trying to protect him. I was trying to save him. From himself, from his circumstances, from the grief he was carrying about his father's death. Whether that was the right thing to do, I honestly don't know. Tom squeezed my hands gently. What does your son say about all this? Has he tried to contact you? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everett and I haven't spoken since he told me I deserved to die alone. I doubt this situation is going to inspire him to break that silence. Maybe it should. Maybe this is exactly what he needs to remember, that you are a real person trying to deal with an impossible situation, not the villain he's turned you into. But even as Tom spoke those optimistic words, I was remembering the cold contempt in Everett's eyes during our last conversation. The man who had looked at me that day wasn't someone who would be moved to empathy by evidence of my past struggles. He was someone who had built his entire adult identity around overcoming the inadequacy of his upbringing, and my journal entries would only confirm his narrative about having to succeed despite rather than because of his family. That evening, I made the mistake of searching for more coverage of the story. The scandal had already spread beyond Jessica Holbrook's initial article. Entertainment blogs were picking up the story, framing it as another example of a self-help guru who's inspiring. Backstory had been fabricated. Social media was buzzing with discussions about authenticity in the motivational speaking industry and whether Everett's troubled past made him more or less qualified to help others overcome adversity. But it was Everett's own response that devastated me completely. He'd released a statement through his publicist that read, in part, "The journal entries referenced in recent media reports represent my late mother's subjective recollections of events from over 25 years ago. While I respect her memory, I cannot be held responsible for her personal interpretations of my adolescent behavior or her decisions regarding how to respond to normal teenage challenges." late mother. He told the world I was dead. I sat staring at those words on my laptop screen, feeling something break inside me that I hadn't even realized was still whole. In the space of a single sentence, Everett had managed to dismiss my perspective, minimize his past behavior, and erase me from his current life so completely that he was willing to pretend I'd never existed at all. The cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't enough for him to cut me out of his life. Now he was cutting me out of his history as well, rewriting our story to make himself an orphan, rather than acknowledging that he had a mother who was still alive and had tried, however imperfectly, to love him. But along with the devastation came something unexpected, a fierce clarity about who Everett really was and what our relationship had always been. He wasn't a wounded son struggling to forgive an inadequate mother. He was a man so committed to his own mythology that he was willing to sacrifice anyone, including the woman who'd raised him, to protect his carefully constructed image. For the first time since leaving my old life behind, I felt completely free of guilt about that decision. Everett had just proven that I'd been right to stop trying to earn love from someone who was incapable of giving it. The media attention intensified over the following weeks, turning my quiet coastal refuge into something resembling a crime scene. News vans lined the street each morning, and I'd taken to leaving the cottage through the back gate to avoid the reporters who seemed to take shifts watching my front door. Tom had become my unofficial bodyguard, running errands for me and deflecting the more aggressive journalists who tried to approach. When I ventured out for my daily walks, the story had taken on a life of its own, expanding far beyond the initial revelation of my journal entries. Jessica Holbrook, the freelance journalist who'd started this avalanche, had apparently been investigating Everett for months before she'd stumbled across my writings at an estate sale. According to the follow-up articles she'd published, a neighbour had mentioned seeing boxes of items from my old house being sold after I'd left, and Jessica had purchased several lots of papers and documents, hoping to find more material for her expose. What she'd found instead was a treasure trove of evidence that contradicted nearly every aspect of Everett's carefully crafted origin story. My journals weren't just from his senior year. She'd somehow acquired several volumes spanning his entire adolescence and young adulthood. Entries where I'd documented his academic struggles in middle school, the tutoring I'd paid for to help him catch up, records of the therapy sessions I'd arranged after Robert's death, which Everett had attended reluctantly and eventually refused to continue. But most damaging were the financial records I'd meticulously kept, evidence of the money I'd spent supporting him through college, the loans I'd taken out to cover his living expenses when his partial scholarship wasn't enough, the consulting fee I'd paid to a professional writer to help him polish his first book proposal. Self-made success. How Dr. Everett Perch built his career on his mother's hidden support. Read the headline of Jessica's latest article. She'd pieced together a financial picture that showed I'd invested nearly $60,000 in Everett's education and early career. Money I'd saved from my teaching salary and borrowed against my retirement to ensure he could focus on his studies and writing without the burden of part-time jobs. None of it was scandalous. Exactly. Parents help their adult children all the time, and there was nothing illegal or even unusual about what I'd done. But it directly contradicted Everett's public narrative about pulling himself up from poverty through sheer determination and hard work. In interviews and speeches, he described paying his own way through college, working multiple jobs to support himself while building his speaking and writing career from nothing. The media had seized on this contradiction with the kind of fervour usually reserved for political scandals. Everett's speaking engagements were being cancelled, his book sales were plummeting, and several corporate clients had quietly ended their consulting contracts. The man who'd built his career on authenticity and overcoming adversity was being exposed as someone who'd had significant advantages he'd simply chosen not to acknowledge. I should have felt vindicated. After years of being cast as the cold, unsupportive mother in his success story, the evidence of my actual role in his life was finally being recognized. But instead of satisfaction, I felt a deep sadness that surprised me with its intensity. Tom found me crying in my garden one afternoon after a particularly brutal day of coverage. The latest article had included quotes from former clients who felt betrayed by Everett's misrepresentations, And the comments section was full of people discussing the ethics of motivational speakers who built their credibility on fictional hardships. I didn't want this, I told him, gesturing helplessly at the newspaper he'd brought me. I never wanted to destroy his career. I just wanted to be left alone. Tom sat beside me on the garden bench we'd built together from driftwood, his presence steady and calming as always. You didn't destroy anything, Stephania. You wrote down the truth in private journals 25 years ago. Someone else chose to make that truth public, but I left them behind. I could have destroyed them before I moved, but I didn't. Some part of me must have wanted this to happen, or some part of you wanted him to find them someday and understand what those years were really like for you. That's not the same thing as wanting his career to be ruined. I considered this, trying to be honest with myself about my motivations when I'd made the decision to leave the journals in my old house. Had I been hoping for eventual reconciliation, or had I been setting a trap? The distinction felt important. But I wasn't sure I could trust my own memory of what I'd been thinking during those emotionally charged weeks after Everett's devastating visit. The worst part, I said, is that he's still lying. Even now, even with all this evidence, he's still trying to control the narrative. Everett's public response to the mounting revelations had been a masterclass in damage control, rather than acknowledge the financial support I'd provided or admit that his background had been more privileged than he'd claimed. He pivoted to attacking the invasion of his family's privacy. He'd hired a crisis management firm that had coached him to frame the story as an example of how success makes people targets for those seeking to tear them down. In a carefully staged interview with a sympathetic local news anchor, he'd appeared thoughtful and wounded, speaking about the pain of having his mother's private thoughts weaponized against him. He described me as a loving but troubled woman whose journals reflected her own mental health struggles rather than objective reality. He'd suggested that my abandonment of our family home indicated a deteriorating psychological state that made my writings unreliable. The performance was flawless, and it was working. Public opinion was beginning to shift in his favor, with some commentators arguing that using a mother's private journals to attack her son's career was unethical regardless of what those journals contained. Support groups for adult children of difficult parents had rallied to Everett's defense, framing him as a victim of maternal manipulation that extended even beyond the grave, because, of course, he was still claiming I was dead. That lie had been the most difficult part of this entire ordeal. Not the exposure of my private thoughts, not the media attention, not even the destruction of Everett's carefully crafted image. It was the casual way he'd erased me from existence, the calculated decision to let the world believe he was an orphan, rather than acknowledge that his mother was still alive and might have her own perspective on their relationship. Have you thought about coming forward? Tom asked gently, setting the record straight about at least being alive. I'd considered it, but every scenario I could imagine ended with more pain for both of us. If I revealed myself to be alive, I'd have to explain why I disappeared from Everett's life, which would inevitably lead to discussing our final conversation and his cruel words about deserving to die alone. That would only provide more ammunition for his narrative about being the victim of an unstable mother. And what would be the point? Everett had made his choice when he told the world I was dead. He'd chosen his public image over any possibility of repairing our relationship. Even if I appeared tomorrow with evidence that I was very much alive, he'd simply claim that my resurrection was further proof of my mental instability. No, I told Tom, let him have his story. I have mine now. That evening, Patricia stopped by with a bottle of wine and an update on the legal situation. Several lawyers had contacted her, offering to represent me in potential lawsuits against both Jessica Holbrook and Everett. The unauthorized publication of my private journals might constitute a violation of copyright and privacy rights, and Everett's false claims about my death could be considered defamation. What do you want to do? Patricia asked as we sat on my small deck watching the sunset. You have options here, real legal recourse if you want to pursue it. I thought about it seriously for the first time since this ordeal had begun. I could hire lawyers, file lawsuits, force Everett to acknowledge that I was alive and that his portrayal of our relationship was dishonest. I could demand corrections and retractions, financial compensation for the invasion of my privacy, public vindication of my role in his success. But all of that would require me to re-enter his world, to engage with the toxic dynamic we'd finally escaped. It would mean months or years of legal proceedings, media coverage, and public scrutiny of our most private family moments. It would mean allowing Everett back into my life in the most adversarial way possible. I don't want anything from him, I realized as I spoke the words. I don't want his money, his acknowledgement, or his apology. I don't even want him to tell the truth about our relationship. I just want him to leave me alone. Patricia nodded, unsurprised by my decision. Sometimes the best revenge is living. Well, and from what I can see, you're doing exactly that. She was right. Despite the chaos of the past few weeks, I was happier than I'd been in decades. My garden was thriving. My friendship with Tom was deepening into something that felt like love. And I'd found a community of people who knew and accepted me for who I was now rather than who I'd been in my previous life. The media attention would fade eventually. Everett would rebuild his career or find a new one, and the world would move on to the next scandal. But I would still be here, in this cottage by the sea, living the life I'd finally learned to choose for myself. That night, I did something I hadn't done since leaving my old house. I started a new journal, not to document my struggles or analyze my failures, but simply to record the details of this life I was building from scratch. I wrote about the tomatoes that were finally starting to ripen in my garden, about the book club meeting where we discussed a novel that had moved me to tears, about the way Tom's hand felt in mine as we walked the beach each morning. I wrote about forgiveness, too, but not the kind I'd once thought I needed. Not forgiveness from Everett for my failures as a mother, but forgiveness of myself for believing that his inability to love me was proof of my unworthiness. I wrote about the relief of finally understanding that some people are simply incapable of the kind of connection I'd spent decades trying to create, and that recognizing that fact wasn't giving up, it was growing up. The journal would stay private this time. I'd learned my lesson about leaving pieces of my heart where someone else could find them and use them as weapons. But writing again felt like reclaiming something essential that I'd lost along the way, the part of myself that existed independent of anyone else's judgment or approval. As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I could hear the ocean through my open window, its constant rhythm a reminder that some things endure regardless of the storms that rage around them. Tomorrow there would probably be more reporters, more articles, more attempts to drag me back into a narrative I'd already escaped, but I was done being a character in someone else's story. From now on, I was writing my own. The turning point came on a Thursday morning in August, 3 months after the scandal had broken, and just as I'd begun to hope the worst was behind us. I was watering my tomatoes when Tom appeared at my garden gate, holding his phone with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock and something that might have been excitement. "Stephania," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "You need to see this." The video he showed me was grainy, clearly shot on someone's phone from the back of what appeared to be a conference room. Everett was at a podium, mid-speech, delivering what looked like one of his standard motivational presentations about overcoming adversity and rewriting your personal narrative. But something was wrong with his usual polished delivery. His voice was strained, and there was a manic quality to his gestures that suggested he was barely holding himself together. "The media wants to define us by our worst moments," he was saying, his hands gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles were white. "They want to reduce our entire life story to our most challenging chapters. But we get to choose which story we tell about ourselves. We get to decide whether we're victims of our circumstances or victors over them." The audience looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as Everett's voice grew louder and more agitated. This wasn't the calm, confident speaker they'd paid to hear. This was a man on the edge of something that looked dangerously close to a breakdown. "My mother was mentally ill," he continued, and I felt my stomach drop. "The journals that have been used to attack my character represent the paranoid delusions of a woman who couldn't accept that her son had succeeded despite her failures as a parent. She documented lies because she couldn't face the truth about her own inadequacy." The room had gone completely silent now, the audience clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond a motivational speech into the realm of public self-destruction. She abandoned our family when I needed her most. Everett's voice cracked slightly. And even in death, even from the grave, she's still trying to destroy everything I've built. But I won't let her. I won't let anyone reduce my life to the ravings of a bitter, unstable woman who chose to die alone rather than take responsibility for her failures. Someone in the audience stood up and walked out. Then another. Within minutes, people were streaming toward the exits while Everett continued his increasingly incoherent rant about media conspiracies and family betrayal. The video ended abruptly, presumably when whoever was recording realized they were documenting the complete professional suicide of a once respected public figure. I handed Tom's phone back to him with shaking hands. When was this? Yesterday. It's already been picked up by every major news outlet. His speaking bureau has dropped him, his publisher has cancelled his book contract, and apparently several former clients are considering lawsuits for misrepresentation. I should have felt vindicated, or at least relieved that Everett had finally revealed his true character to the world. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. The man in that video wasn't the successful motivational speaker who'd built his career on inspiring others. He wasn't even the cold, cruel son who told me I deserved to die alone. He was someone who'd lost control completely, someone whose carefully constructed facade had cracked so thoroughly that he'd destroyed himself in front of a room full of strangers. There's more, Tom said gently. Jessica Holbrook published a follow-up article this morning. She's been digging deeper into Everett's background, and she found some things that ... Well, they change everything. The article Tom showed me was titled The Everett Perch Investigation. New evidence suggests motivational speaker's mother is still alive. Jessica had apparently been as surprised as anyone by Everett's claims about my death, and had decided to investigate whether his grief-stricken behavior might be genuine or simply another layer of deception. What she discovered was a paper trail that definitively proved I was alive, utility bills forwarded to my new address, voter registration records, even a credit card transaction from just last week. But more importantly, she'd tracked down my old neighbors and former teaching colleagues, people who remembered the circumstances of my departure and could provide context for why a 72-year-old woman might choose to disappear from her son's life. Entirely. The picture that emerged from Jessica's interviews was devastating for Everett's narrative. Former neighbors described the police cars that had occasionally appeared at our house during his teenage years, the rumors about drinking and drug use that I'd apparently worked hard to suppress. A fellow teacher mentioned my visible stress during Everett's senior year, how I'd aged dramatically in the span of a few months, and he'd confided my fears about his behavior to trusted colleagues. But most damaging was an interview with Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd lived next door to us for 15 years. She'd apparently witnessed the final confrontation between Everett and me, had heard him screaming at me through our kitchen window about deserving to die alone. She'd seen me leave the house the next morning with suitcases and had never seen Amy return. I always wondered what happened to Stephania, Mrs. Henderson was quoted as saying. She was such a kind woman, always checking on me when I was sick, bringing me vegetables from her garden, when she disappeared so suddenly after that awful fight with her son. I feared the worst. I'm relieved to know she's alive and apparently doing well somewhere. The article painted a picture of a mother who'd sacrificed everything for a troubled son, only to be driven away by his cruelty and ingratitude. It recontextualized my journals not as the paranoid ravings of a mentally ill woman, but as the honest reflections of a single mother struggling to save her child from self-destruction. But the most shocking revelation came at the end of the article. Jessica had somehow obtained a copy of the police report from the night Everett had been brought home during his senior year, the incident I'd written about in my journal, but had worked to keep out of official school records. The report detailed how 17-year-old Everett Perch had been found unconscious in a downtown park, surrounded by drug paraphernalia and in the company of known dealers. He'd been hospitalized for overdose, and only his mother's intervention and cooperation with authorities had kept him from being charged with possession. The officer who'd written the report, now retired, had agreed to speak with Jessica about The case, Mrs. Perch was terrified. He was quoted as saying, "She kept saying she just wanted her son to have a chance at a normal life, that losing his father had nearly destroyed him, and she couldn't bear to see him lose his future too." She worked with us to get him into counselling and agreed to regular check-ins. Without her advocacy, that kid would have had a criminal record that would have followed him forever. By the time I finished reading, I was crying, not from sadness, but from a relief I hadn't even realised I needed. For the first time in 26 years, someone was telling the truth about what those difficult years had actually been like. Not Everett's version, where he'd overcome adversity through personal strength, and not even my version, filtered through years of guilt and self-doubt, but the objective truth as witnessed by others. I had been a good mother, not perfect, not naturally warm or intuitive, but fundamentally good. I'd protected my son when he needed protection, supported him when he needed support, and sacrificed my own financial security to ensure his future success. The fact that he'd chosen to rewrite that history didn't change the reality of what had actually happened. "How do you feel?" Tom asked, watching my face carefully as I processed everything I'd read. "Free," I said, and realized it was completely true. For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely free. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter, but something made me pick up. "Mother?" Everett's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and broken in a way I'd never heard before. "Are you there?" I said nothing, too shocked to formulate words. "I know you're alive," he continued, his voice cracking. "I know you've been alive this whole time, and I know what I did to you." I know what I said. Still, I remained silent, listening to my son cry for the first time since he was a child. "I've lost everything," he whispered. "My career, my reputation, my credibility, everything I built is gone, and it's all my fault. I did this to myself." "Yes," I said finally, my voice steady and calm. "You did. I need help, Mother. I need ... I don't know what I need, but I can't do this alone anymore. I can't keep pretending I'm someone I'm not." For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull, the maternal instinct to rescue, to comfort, to rush in and try to fix whatever was broken. But then I remembered his words from our last conversation, the cold contempt in his eyes as he told me I deserved to die alone. I remembered the years of being cast as the villain in his success story, the way he'd erased me from his life, so thoroughly that he told the world I was dead. "I'm sorry you're struggling, Everett," I said, and meant it. "But I can't help you anymore. I spent 45 years trying to help you, and you told me it was never enough. You told me I deserved to die alone. So now you get to figure out how to live without me. Please," he sobbed. I was angry. I was hurt. "I didn't mean..." "You meant every word," I interrupted. "And you were probably right. Maybe I wasn't the mother you needed. Maybe I did fail you in fundamental ways. But you're 45 years old, Everett. Whatever damage I did, whatever I failed to give you, that's your responsibility to heal now, not mine." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. Tom found me sitting in my garden an hour later, staring at the ocean and trying to process what had just happened. When I told him about Everett's call, he pulled me close and held me while I cried, not for my son, but for the woman I'd been for so many years, the woman who'd believed her worth was tied to someone else's ability to love her. "Are you okay?" he asked when my tears finally stopped. "I think so," I said. "Actually, I think I'm better than okay. I think I'm finally exactly who I'm supposed to be. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough." 1 year later, I was tending my garden when the estate sale notice appeared in my mailbox. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize, but the contents were clear enough. Everett had apparently lost his house to foreclosure, and his remaining possessions were being liquidated to pay his debts. The notice was a courtesy, informing me as his next of kin that if I wanted to claim any family heirlooms or items of sentimental value, I had 30 days to contact the estate sale company. I set the letter aside and continued working with my tomatoes, which had become the pride of my coastal garden. The plants were heavy with fruit now. red and yellow varieties that thrived in the sandy soil, I'd learned to amend with patience and persistence. Tom had built me raised beds the previous spring, and together we'd created something that exceeded both of our expectations, a space that was both productive and beautiful, functional and peaceful. "Bad news?" Tom asked, appearing at the garden gate with his usual timing that suggested he'd been watching for my reaction to the mail. "A state sale notice for Everett's things," I said, brushing soil from my hands. "Apparently he's lost the house," Tom nodded, but didn't offer commentary. He'd learned over the past year that I preferred to process information about Everett without immediate analysis or advice. The time for well-meaning suggestions about forgiveness and reconciliation had passed, replaced by acceptance of my decision to maintain complete separation from my son's life. The years since his public breakdown had been transformative for both of us, though in dramatically different directions. While Everett's career and financial stability had collapsed entirely, I'd built something entirely new from the foundation of independence I'd been constructing since leaving my old life behind. My relationship with Tom had deepened into the kind of partnership I'd never experienced, even during my marriage to Robert. We'd moved through the seasons together, sharing daily routines and long-term planning without the desperate neediness that had characterized my younger relationships. At 73, I'd finally learned the difference between companionship and dependency, between choosing someone and needing them. We'd taken trips together, to Portland for theatre performances, to local farmers markets, to coastal towns further north where we'd explored tide pools and art galleries. But we'd also maintained our separate homes and individual interests, understanding that the health of our relationship depended on each of us having a complete life independent of the other. I'd also continued writing, not in journals this time, but in what had started as letters to myself and evolved into something like memoir. Not for publication. I had no interest in adding my voice to the public discourse about family dysfunction and late life reinvention, but for my own understanding of how I'd arrived at this place of contentment. The writing had helped me process not just my relationship with Everett, but my entire approach to love and attachment. I'd spent decades believing that my worth as a person was determined by my success in making other people happy, particularly my husband and son. When Robert died, I transferred all of that desperate people-pleasing energy to Everett, trying to earn his love by anticipating his needs and minimizing my own. But Everett had needed something I couldn't provide, not because I was inadequate, but because what he'd needed was to develop his own emotional resilience rather than depending on someone else to manage his feelings for him. My attempts to cushion his pain and smooth his path had actually delayed his development into a self-sufficient adult. Though I couldn't have known that at the time, the revelation wasn't bitter. Exactly, it was simply clarifying. I'd done the best I could with the information and emotional tools I'd had available. The outcome hadn't been what I'd hoped for, but that didn't make my efforts meaningless or my love insufficient. 3 days after receiving the estate sale notice, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove back to my old town, not to attend the sale, but to see the house where I'd raised Everett one last time before it passed into other hands. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered, the trees taller and the houses more weathered. My former home showed signs of neglect, overgrown landscaping, peeling paint, newspapers accumulating on the front porch. It looked like a place where someone had given up caring about appearances, where maintenance had been deferred until problems became crises. I parked across the street and sat in my car for nearly an hour, watching people arrive for the estate sale. Most appeared to be professional dealers and collectors, people who approached other families' possessions with the dispassion efficiency of those seeking profit rather than sentiment. But there were also neighbours I recognised, people who'd known Everett as a child and were perhaps curious about what remained of our family's life in this house. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the house next door and waved when she recognised me. I'd spoken with her briefly after Jessica Holbrook's articles had been published, thanking her for providing an honest account of what she'd witnessed during those final difficult months. She approached my car with the careful movements of someone who'd aged significantly in the years since I'd seen her. "Stephania, dear, I'm so glad to see you looking well," she said, leaning down to my car window. "I've wondered about you often. Thank you for telling the truth about what happened," I said. "It meant more than you probably realized," she nodded, her expression sad but unsurprised. "I never understood how that boy could turn on you the way he did. You were such a devoted mother, especially during those troubled years. I always thought he'd come to his senses eventually and appreciate what you'd sacrificed for him. People become who they choose to become," I said. "I've made peace with his choices." Mrs. Henderson glanced back at the house, where strangers were carrying out furniture and boxes of personal belongings. "It's heartbreaking, really, all those years of working and saving and hoping, and it comes down to people pouring through your things looking for bargains." I knew she meant it kindly, but I felt no heartbreak watching my former life being dismantled and distributed to strangers. The woman who'd lived in that house and accumulated those possessions had been someone different, someone who'd measured her worth by her ability to maintain the illusion of a functional family. That woman deserved compassion, but I felt no particular attachment to her choices or disappointments. "Sometimes starting over is exactly what we need," I told Mrs. Henderson. "Sometimes holding on to things just prevents us from becoming who we're meant to be." I drove home to my cottage that afternoon, feeling lighter rather than melancholy. The estate sale had been a kind of funeral for the life I'd left behind, a final ceremony marking the end of my identity as Everett's mother, and the beginning of whatever came next. Tom was waiting for me on the deck he'd built overlooking my garden, reading a book and occasionally glancing up to watch the evening light change on the ocean. He looked up when he heard my car and set aside his reading without asking where I'd been or what I'd found there. After a year together, we'd learned to trust each other's need for privacy and processing time. "How was your day?" he asked. The question general enough to let me share whatever I felt comfortable discussing. "Clarifying," I said, settling into the chair beside him. "I think I'm finally ready to stop looking backward." "What does that mean?" I considered his question while watching the waves that had become the rhythm of my new life. What did it mean to stop looking backward when you'd spent 7 decades accumulating experiences and relationships and regrets? I think it means accepting that some chapters of our lives are finished, even if they didn't end the way we hoped they would. And recognizing that starting a new chapter doesn't require us to pretend the previous ones didn't happen. Tom reached for my hand, his fingers warm and familiar against mine. "Are you talking about Everett specifically, or something larger?" "Both, I suppose. I spent 45 years trying to be the mother he needed me to be, and I failed. Not because I didn't love him enough or try hard enough, but because what he needed was something I couldn't provide. That failure doesn't define me unless I let it, and now I get to find out who I am when I'm not trying to earn someone else's approval. I get to discover what I actually want from the time I've left, instead of what I think I should want based on other people's expectations." As if to underscore my point, the wooden robin Tom had carved for me during our early friendship caught the evening light on my kitchen windowsill. The small bird still reminded me daily of the possibility of flight, of choosing new directions rather than remaining trapped by old patterns. That night, I started a new piece of writing, not about my past this time, but about the future I was still creating. I wrote about the garden Tom and I were planning for next spring, with fruit trees and berry bushes that would take years to reach maturity. I wrote about the book club I'd joined and the friendships I was forming with women who knew nothing about my history as a failed mother, but appreciated my opinions about literature and current events. I wrote about love, too, but a different kind than I'd ever experienced before. Not the desperate attachment I'd felt for Robert or the anxious devotion I'd directed toward Everett, but something steadier and more sustainable. Love based on choice rather than need, on appreciation rather than dependency. The phone rang while I was writing, displaying a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered not answering, remembering Everett's desperate call from the previous year. But something prompted me to pick up. "Is this Stephania Perch?" The voice was female, young, nervous. "Yes, my name is Amy Chen. I'm a social worker in Portland, and I'm calling about your son, Everett. He's been hospitalized following what appears to be a suicide attempt, and you're listed as his emergency contact." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The automatic maternal response to news that my child was in danger. But underneath that instinct was something new, a boundary I'd built over the past year that wouldn't be easily breached. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "But I'm not able to serve as his emergency contact anymore. We're estranged." "Mum, I understand family relationships can be complicated, but he's asking for you specifically. He says he needs to apologize, that he has things he needs to say before ... before what?" Before he tries again, the manipulation was so familiar it almost made me laugh. Even in crisis, even facing the complete collapse of everything he'd built, Everett was still trying to use emotional leverage to get what he wanted from me. The threat of suicide, the promise of apology, the suggestion that I held the key to his survival, it was all designed to trigger my maternal guilt and override my hard-won boundaries. "Miss Chen," I said gently, "my son is 46 years old. He's responsible for his own choices and his own healing. If he's genuinely suicidal, he needs professional help, not rescue from a parent he's already rejected. Please connect him with appropriate mental health resources. But don't call me again." I hung up and immediately turned off my phone, then sat in my quiet kitchen processing what I'd just done. A year ago, even 6 months ago, I would have been in my car within minutes, driving through the night to reach Everett's bedside regardless of how he'd treated me. But the woman sitting in this cottage by the sea was someone different. She was someone who'd learned to distinguish between love and enabling, between compassion and self-destruction. She was someone who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for another person is refuse to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. Tom appeared in my kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of my phone conversation. He took one look at my face and crossed the room to hold me, not asking questions, but simply providing the steady presence that had become my anchor in this new life. "I'm okay," I told him, and realized it was true. I'm sad for him, but I'm okay. "What do you need?" The question was perfect in its simplicity. Not what I should do, or what would be right, or what other people would expect. Just what I needed in this moment to remain true to the person I'd worked so hard to become. "I need to finish my writing," I said, "and then I need to water my garden and plan tomorrow's dinner and read another chapter of the book we're discussing next week. I need to keep living the life I've built instead of getting pulled back into someone else's crisis." Tom nodded and released me, understanding without explanation why those ordinary activities felt necessary rather than trivial. We'd both learned that sometimes the most radical act is choosing your own well-being over someone else's drama, choosing growth over guilt, choosing the future over the past. Later that evening, I stood in my garden under a canopy of stars, listening to the ocean that had become the soundtrack of my new life. Somewhere, Everett was in a hospital bed, facing the wreckage of the life he'd built on lies and manipulation. Somewhere, reporters were probably already crafting stories about the fall of a once successful motivational speaker. Somewhere, people were discussing the ethics of parents who abandon their adult children, even when those children have become toxic. But here, in this place I'd created from nothing but determination and hope, I was exactly who I was meant to be. Not a perfect mother or a perfect woman, but someone who'd learned to love herself enough to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Someone who'd found peace not through forgiveness or reconciliation, but through the simple act of choosing her own happiness over someone else's approval. The garden around me was full of life I'd nurtured from seeds and saplings, plants that had thrived because I'd learned to provide what they needed rather than what I thought they should want. The cottage behind me held books I'd chosen, furniture I'd selected, memories I'd created with people who appreciated rather than tolerated my presence. This was what freedom looked like, I realized. Not the absence of difficult emotions or complex relationships, but the presence of choice. The knowledge that whatever happened next, I would face it as someone who belonged to herself first, someone who'd learned the difference between love and dependency, between caring and enabling. I went inside and finished the piece I'd been writing, ending it with a reflection that felt like both conclusion and beginning. At 73, I finally understand that the most important relationship I'll ever have is the one with myself. Everything else Friendship, romance, family connection is enhanced when it grows from that foundation rather than substituting for it. I spent decades trying to earn love by making myself indispensable to others. Now I know that the love worth having is the kind that appreciates rather than uses, that chooses rather than needs, that enhances rather than completes. I saved the document and closed my laptop, then walked to my bedroom window that looked out over the ocean. Tomorrow, there would be new growth in my garden, new conversations with Tom, new pages in whatever book I was reading. There would be small pleasures and ordinary challenges. The reliable rhythm of a life lived for its own sake, rather than for someone else's approval. And if Everett survived his crisis and tried again to contact me, I would be ready with the same clear boundary I'd maintained for over a year. I wished him well, but I was no longer available to be his mother. That relationship had ended the day he told me I deserved to die alone, and no amount of subsequent crisis or manipulation would. Resurrected, some endings are beginnings in disguise. Some losses are actually liberation. Some failures are the foundation for a completely different kind of success. At 73, I was finally free to discover what that success might look like when it belonged entirely to me. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.